Thank you very much. Good morning, Dr. Dean, Dr. Tai, the organizer and sponsor of this conference, the moderator, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe before I start, I can ask you a succession of quick questions. How many of you this morning, before you came to the conference, checked your email? Hands up. Okay, thank you very much. How many of you checked your Facebook before you came to email to this conference? Okay, thank you. And my last question is, how many of you, while you were sleeping last night, for one reason or another, got up and also checked either your email or Facebook? Oh, there you go. So today, very briefly, in 15-20 minutes, what I want to do is to try to suggest how important new media has become and how many people would, even in the middle of the night, during an elections, would be checking their email. And I want to just quickly share some experiences from two countries, Malaysia and Singapore, which I know quite well. And essentially why, countries like Malaysia and Singapore are interesting to study is because they have a unique brand of soft authoritarianism, which means basically very much central control, a strong leading political party, and part of the ethos is actually some kind of central control over the traditional media. And this has been seen as some kind of challenge for the flowering of democracy. So when new media came to the scene, it was seen as an opportunity to challenge some of the status quo. If you are a scholar, looking at these countries, most of the time you will see them studied differently. Very seldom do you see them studied together because of colonial history and post-colonial politics. You may not know this, but Malaysian newspapers are not allowed by law to be circulated in Singapore. Singapore newspapers are also not allowed to be circulated in Malaysia because they wanted to keep the countries separate and distinct because of the post-colonial, post-independence experience. But with the internet, you cannot keep these things separate. And therefore, I think it's interesting to study them together. Also, two kind of ideas, two big ideas. I mentioned at the start that new media may give some hope for more greater information expression in authoritarian regimes or soft authoritarian regimes like the countries under study. But the thinking, the intellectual thinking behind it is, as time progresses, those in power will catch up, and the benefits that the disadvantaged or the weak has had may disappear. And I want to suggest that slowly in these two countries, Singapore and Malaysia, which have very high internet penetration, there is some kind of movement towards that. The second big idea is new media can make some kind of impact for the marginalized, for opposition parties in such regimes, to make improvements in their electoral success. You will see studies from these two countries show that at times this seemed to be the case, but at the end, the conclusion is inconclusive. So using these examples, these two big ideas, how is it like in the rest of the countries that we're looking at in the panel, and perhaps also here and around the region close by. Also, the last big point is is the notion of democracy viable? If in countries such as Malaysia and Singapore, where the ruling party has been in power for so long, nearly up to 50 years, and the arrival of the net may give hope that that kind of authoritarian regime can be challenged with greater information, greater participation, but if such benefits that we have seen early on are being pushed back, then is our hope for democracy or that form of governance even relevant? If we look at China, we look at Vietnam, there are more advanced forms of control. So that allows us to kind of think about these things. But in short, what is the impact of new media on the elections results in these countries? Just some quick numbers for you to have a look. If you look at the first table, Malaysia, it has, if you look at, they had their last election last year, 2013. You have a population of 30 million. You will see that if you look at the last column on 2013, they have 18 million voters. More than 13 voted. Now, Malaysia is a system where it is not compulsory voting. So if there is any evidence that we can suggest that is of value that the internet can provide, it's its capacity to mobilize people. So the studies show, in countries where there is no compulsory voting, the internet's biggest value lies in its capacity to bring out numbers to vote. If you look at Singapore, just down below, the last election was held in 2011. You can notice that it has had, population increase over 5 million, but many of them are, not citizens but residents. So the eligible voters are only half, a little over 2 million. And what is interesting is internet has no impact on mobilization because it's compulsory voting. If you don't vote, you pay a nominal fine of 5 Singapore dollars, which is about maybe 3 euros or a little bit, to have your name reinstated so you can vote again. So these are just some hard numbers. You can see right at below, internet penetration in Singapore is 85% and still climbing. It's nearly saturated, whereas in Malaysia, it's increasing. And many countries in Asia, the internet penetration is rising exponentially, and therefore, the discussion is relevant. We also need to look at social media because first is internet penetration, then it's broadband consumption, then it's social media. And that's why I asked how many of you check your Facebook and then email. From the show of hands, I got nearly 80-90% checked their email and maybe around 60 to 70% Facebook. So you can see looking at the top or on your right, on your left, my right, your left. In Malaysia, social media increased, like Facebook, 25% to nearly 80% just in a matter of 5 years. And if you look at Singapore, although there are no numbers for the previous elections, the numbers are also quite high in terms of social media penetration. So over 70, nearly 80%. And if you look below at the table, again, the number of users is quite high. Although there's no correlation, but the numbers are equivalent or slightly in excess of the number of voters. So you can see that it's interesting to study this phenomena because of the high volume of people online and so on. The other issue why it's relevant, and this is kind of across the board, many countries have the same phenomena, and you can think about it also in your jurisdiction. There's a drop in circulation, especially of print media, and the eyeballs shift away from broadcast. I have numbers here of print media. You can see in the Malaysian case at the top table, in 2008, the vernacular paper, which is the Malay language paper, was about 1 million plus, and it's dropped by 200,000. And the English newspaper also dropped about 5 to 10% there. If you look at Singapore below, let's look at the numbers in 2011 and 2006. The English newspapers have dropped, maybe about 10%, and the Chinese newspapers, Chinese language newspapers have dropped significantly by over 20–30%. And we have 80% Chinese population, and a majority of them still speak Mandarin and read Mandarin, and still there's a push. It's a mixture of people shifting to online platforms, but it's also a mixture of the lack of trust on state-owned or state-controlled, either directly or indirectly, the mainstream media. So people shift away from these sources to alternative sources, many of which online. So the question to ask is, even though there's a shift online, is it making a difference? And I want to suggest to you, in the early days, it seems it was, but because of the big idea that those in power do catch up, I think the initial gains are kind of taken away, and therefore we have to go back and ask, can we expect democratic reform in these kinds of regimes if one of the possible facilitators, such as the new media, could aid that process? This is just a quick idea. I raised the issue of the legitimacy or the credibility of the mainstream papers. And if you look at some of this international ranking index, of course we can debate about the methodology and so on. But just broadly, just for you to cite and have a point to think about, the mainstream newspapers or media, their rankings are quite low by international standards, and occasionally they slide even further. But, and this is both in Malaysia and Singapore. Now I'll go quickly, very quickly, just to let you know how media development has been in Malaysia. Basically, you see the timelines of 4 elections, but essentially, what you need to understand is they all started online. In Malaysia, there was no legislation about the internet for any purposes. So the Malaysian context was pretty free. The ones that went online were mostly NGOs and opposition parties. They started with websites. They evolved, improved the quality of the websites, and eventually moved into social media, having Twitter accounts, having Facebook accounts, and also having video YouTube channels. There is a phenomena here that will be interesting for you to keep in your mind. Essentially, as the internet evolved, let's say in Malaysia, and it's similar in the case in Singapore as well, you will find that the institution, the political party, was not the most popular political website. In fact, it was either the party leaders or what we call the star candidates who were having larger traction online, whether by way of blogs, Facebook sites, and even Twitter accounts. Again, although this is not the focus of my finding here, because I'm giving you something at the general level, I can digress and share with you that on studies of individual personalities, political personalities, it doesn't demonstrate, again, no matter how popular you are online, that this will actually translate to results. So those of you who are casually aware of this phenomena will find credibility in the argument that perhaps, all those things about the new media is in real political terms not working. So what you need to take away from the Malaysian case is it evolved, but to date, there is no real internet law that controls such expressions online. This is very different from Singapore, and I think this is where you need to think about, other jurisdictions. In Singapore, it was also the same. The opposition parties were first to go online and start websites, blogs, and then they evolved with Facebook accounts, Twitter, YouTube channels. But every step of the way, the state introduced legislation. And it prevented, so in Singapore, they always had to kind of deal with because the legislation was introduced just before you got the boom or the growth on the internet platform for this sort of, frontline runners. So in that sense, the use was quite muted in Singapore. Except in 2006 elections, when suddenly there was a social swell, and many people during the elections decided to ignore the rules. So this is the fundamental difference. So the key takeaway point is the growth of the internet is also, to some extent, controlled by introducing new and innovative legislation. I have the results here, and I have 5 minutes, so I'll just give you the quick take. Essentially, the results are not conclusive. In the Malaysian case, in the last 2 elections, what has happened in Malaysian case has been that there have been a lot of people turning up for voting because it's not compulsory voting. So the Malaysian case simply shares with us that in terms of voter mobilization during election, it's working. The opposition managed to get popular votes, increase in popular votes, in fact, more than 50% in the last election, but it's unable to translate it into winning seats. In Singapore, no matter how much internet that you throw, it doesn't really result in any improved electoral showing. If you look at the results of the last election here in Singapore, the one in the blue, you will see the opposition finally managed to get 7 seats, most of it by one particular political party, which was not very big online anyway. So what is the net conclusion? I think the net conclusion is in jurisdictions there where there is no compulsory voting, the use of the internet for mobilization can encourage high voter turnout, as the case was in Malaysia, but in Singapore, because it's compulsory voting, it has no impact. And also, where there is growth in internet use, you'll find the states introduce new legislation, but the new phenomena, the new cutting-edge phenomena is ruling parties are now online. Recent developments in Malaysia, which took place last year, shows that the ruling party spent a lot of money on its online advertisement, including money using its position as in government, using the ministries to push out ads online. So both on traditional media as well as online. So you find that increasingly that such soft authoritarian regimes and parties in power in those countries are going online, spending, because they got rich coffers, either from the advantage of being in the state or also as political parties, spending money online. But it doesn't mean that it actually improves their showing. I think ultimately politics is about policies and how people feel about such issues at that time. And I think in this environment, ruling parties are spending money and only can stay afloat. As you can see, they are kind of sliding down, but not quite out. My final takeaway within a minute is essentially that what you need to look for in these countries and elsewhere, and here I just put out a chart, and if you look at the last column, in these countries, because of legislation and also contestation online, there is also a threat on the internet. So you'll find the international NGOs that were doing rankings about traditional medias have now moved on to do rankings in this country. There's no ranking available from these institutions in Singapore, but you can see it'll be just a matter of time when these figures come up. So to sum up, it seems that ruling regimes in this country through legislation and also being offensive, going offensive online, can reduce the initial gap, and therefore, moving forward, I don't think we will really see that great advantage. I think in some countries you will see the evolution of, greater political space, but eventually it looks like it will be knocked back. So therefore, it makes an interesting point for research, not just in Asia, but as well beyond. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Before we go, can I have a very quick question?
Sure.
Like just before the local elections in Turkey, Erdogan ordered to filter Twitter. Was there any cases where you called in soft authoritarian regimes have used any filtering, blocking before the elections to make the social networks, Twitter, Facebook, or whatever else, down?
Yeah. In Southeast Asia, so far, there has been no evidence of that kind of pre-blocking. But where we are looking at that would be very interesting is Myanmar, because the elections is in 2015. We don't know how the junta-sponsored political parties would react. So we are not sure. So I think that's really the site to watch. But at the moment, there are no past examples as such.
Thank you, James.